Can Can you hear me? Let me turn it down a bit. Is that good for you, Marcel? Okay. Should I turn it down at all, or that'll work? Okay. We're going to leave it loud. The main reason I'm doing this is in case anybody is not able to hear just off the strength of my voice, but also because we have some of our friends watching from different cities that couldn't make it here in person for a variety of reasons. But I know we've got folks watching the live stream, so we want to capture that sound. Well, uhuru. Uhuru, and if you don't know what that means, that is a Swahili word for freedom. We say it in place of greetings, departures, thank yous, whatever. We want freedom on our mind at all times. That was the war cry of the Mau Mau revolutions, and it's been reclaimed by African internationalist movement known as the Uhuru movement, because freedom should be on our minds at all times. And we know damn well that there's no freedom until Africa and African people worldwide are free. And all colonized peoples worldwide are free. And part of that freedom requires those of us in the colonizer nation, those of us from Europe, to be returning all that we have stolen over the past 600 years of colonial terror. So before we actually get started, I need to salute my leadership, the African People's Socialist Party, led by Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the founder of the African People's Socialist Party, but also the creator of African internationalism, which is the theory and practice that guides all of this reparations work that you've come into either right now today or in the recent past. And I want to salute the deputy chair of the African People's Socialist Party, the economic powerhouse, the mitochondria of the Uhuru movement, Deputy Chair Onizane Yeshitela, architect of the Black Power Blueprint. And in the Uhuru movement, we understand that the political and the economic are one, so there is no separation. If there's not economic self-determination, there's no actual power being held. Yeah, so salute to my leadership, but I also want to salute my leadership on the solidarity side of the movement. Chairwoman Penny Hess, who's the top of the African People's Solidarity Committee, the first white woman to take a real stance of reparations to African people, not liberal lip service, which we're very familiar with here in the Pacific Northwest, and the U.S. at large, but especially here. People love to talk, but action is very few and far between. So Chairwoman Penny Hess took that historic stance of reparations 40 years ago, 4 decades ago, and has been actively working under Chairman O'Malley's leadership to make reparations a household word, which you've probably heard in the past year or so. There's a lot of Democrats that are ready and willing to bastardize reparations and make it into a housing program or some joke of a charitable welfare state, which we already saw a couple times over in the past few decades. So, but if you flash back a couple years ago to 2017, the Uhuru movement was running a campaign in St. Petersburg, Florida, with Chair Jesse Neville, another one of our leaders here in the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, chair of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. Chair Jesse Neville was running for mayor, and our director of agitation and propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, Akile Anaid, was running for city council on a reparations ticket. Now this was just in 2017. And if you saw any of the news coverage about it, we were crazy. We were a fringe organization. This was so, white people would never agree to pay reparations, right? What do you hear now? What do you hear now? It's the litmus test. You have to answer the question of reparations if you are a Democratic candidate. Shoot, some of the conservatives are having to talk about reparations. And this is the movement that's been pushing that for over 40 years. So we're very fortunate to not have to wonder what would reparations look like, or what might happen if we pass a bill to investigate if reparations is owed, first of all, and then what format it should come in. We don't need to ask those questions because in the Uhuru movement we've already been actively paying reparations, building those independent economic institutions, and African people, the African working class, are demanding their freedom all day, every day, with or without this parasitic colonizer, settler colonial state deciding if they're going to honor those demands. It's irrelevant. When they have power over their own lives, you don't need the permission of the oppressor. So, that was a lot of words. But let me tell you about who I am and who we are and how we got to this room right now. My name is Jesse Call. I'm the chair of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement here in Seattle and Spokane. Spokattle is what we call it for short. And we have some of our comrades who came here from Spokane and some who were not able to join us due to health contradictions. But we in the Uhuru Solidarity Movement have 3 very simple principles of unity. First one I already told you about 100 times, which is that we were created by and we're accountable to the African People's Socialist Party. Second one is that we believe all African people have a right to their own self-determination, so it is never our place as white people to tell an African what their freedom should look like, whether or not they're in APSP, that's the shorthand for African People's Socialist Party, so I don't have to keep saying all those words over and over again. Whether or not they're in APSP is irrelevant to us. You're never going to see a member of the Who Solidarity Movement arguing with an African on the street about what their freedom looks like, to where you might see that with a run-of-the-mill anti-racist group, to where we believe that we're all in this struggle together. Seattle's real big on this multicultural politic of everybody's voice is equally as valid. But we don't operate under that. We operate under Africans must lead. The African working class in particular must lead. None of this petty bourgeois stuff that we've seen. We will operate under the people who have the boot of imperialism most firmly planted on their throat, and that's who guides our work. So those are the first two principles. And the third principle, which is what makes us a little bit different than somebody who just has ideological unity, the third principle is that we engage in material solidarity. Real solidarity, tangible solidarity. And what that looks like is reparations. We go back into the white community, we raise the demand for reparations, and then we raise concrete reparations to fund these economic development projects. Three very simple principles. That's all you have to kind of unite with to be a part of the Who Solidarity movement. Now, how does all of this work tie in to Pride Month, to Pride? Is anybody familiar with Stonewall? Anybody in this room? I see a handful of hands. Can somebody just tell me real quick what you know about Stonewall? Just shout it all out. Gene.
The police came in and they told the trans people that they had to get out of here and stop meeting and just took them all to jail.
So there was if you're not able to hear because the microphone wasn't on Gene said that there were police that came in and they told the trans folks, what they tell them?
Get out, disperse, go away.
To disperse, to not be there, your presence is not welcome, etc., etc. Now, a lot of these trans folks were sex workers. The vast majority of them were African and colonized people. And the one who led the riot, the rebellion, Marsha P. Johnson, an African trans woman, I don't know if she would feel very honored by the Pride celebrations we're seeing right now. Does anybody else understand where I'm going with this? So a riot that started as an African trans woman, because we know African people have resisted genocide from the time before they were even stolen from the continent of Africa, before Africa was stolen, African people have always been resisting. So that, of course, an African trans woman is going to be resisting police brutality in the African community, in the colonized community, an illegitimate body of colonizers coming in to tell Africans what they can and cannot do with their lives, with their bodies, etc., right? With the limited means of commerce that they actually have, right? Being able to engage in sex work might have been the only option that a lot of these trans folks had at the time. So you had this illegitimate body come in and tell them what they could and could not do, which the white man has been doing since we started all this, right? And then you go to Capitol Hill and you hear the Pride celebrations overview of Stonewall. You don't hear even the fact that Marsha P. Johnson was African mentioned. We pulled up the little booklet last time we were in here 2 weeks ago, and we saw two white LGBTQIA folks on that picture that said celebrating Stonewall, and in the background there was a painted picture that might have looked vaguely brown, right? That's how far removed African resistance is from Pride right now. Watched Washington, D.C. Pride the other day, and we saw Lockheed Martin with a float going down the Pride parade. Do you really think that a lesbian mother in Syria cares if there's a rainbow flag on the drone that's dropped on them? Do you think that? Do you think a trans person in Libya gives a damn if you flew that rainbow flag before you decided to shoot up their entire school? Like, this is preposterous. And do you think Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera would really want to be grinding on cops, the same people whose illegitimate existence they thought should have never been ruling in the first place? No. So this is the real legacy of Pride right now, African resistance in the belly of the beast, and also this is where white people of any sector of the colonizer population, whether you're oppressed within the colonizer nation or not, this is where we can find our freedom. That it should not be about us leading the struggle. It should not be about our rights at the expense of African lives. It should be about solidarity with the most oppressed peoples of the planet, because we know if the most oppressed peoples of the planet are leading the struggle, then everybody's life is going to get better, right? And that's why we in USM do not lead this struggle. Because historically, when we've been involved in this work, we always make it about ourselves. Civil rights movement, made it about ourselves. Affirmative action benefited white women. We always find a way. LGBTQIA struggle has become a struggle for marriage integration and military integration. We always make it about ourselves, so we must work under African leadership. And the person that is going to start our presentation today knows exactly what that looks like. They are the chair of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement in Portland. They are the chair of the USM Tours and Speakers Bureau. That's a lot of words. They are the chair of the Western region of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, and they are a phenomenal speaker, a phenomenal individual who has taken a historic stance of reparations to African people, lives it out all day, every day. Was just marching a couple days ago, and it was so powerful to see this campaign being brought to the parades in Portland. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce my comrade, Mads Ambrose. Uhuru.
Thank you, Jesse, for that introduction and that overview. Jesse really hit on a lot of points that we're going to be repeating and going deeper into. So I really appreciate you just kind of laying it all out there. And I just also want to appreciate the USM Seattle and Spokane for hosting this event and doing a lot of really great work. There's a lot of people behind this, and I just really, really appreciate all you comrades so much for carrying out the work despite time, and you have other things going on. Just a lot of revolutionary love for you all. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'm also going to talk about the principles of unity. We'll repeat ourselves a little bit. And so USM, the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, is an organization of mostly white people that was actually formed by the African People's Socialist Party. So we did not form ourselves. We were formed by African revolutionaries as a strategy to go into the white community and to talk about Black power and reparations. And so, and we win reparations to the economic institutions and political campaigns and community work of the African People's Socialist Party. And the 3 principles of unity is what makes you a member. So if you unite with the principles of unity, you can become a member, a sustainer. And any question that comes up, we usually can look to these 3 principles of unity to tell us, whether we're being accountable to the African working class. So one's that we're under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, so we have a little thing in the organization called democratic centralism that keeps the centralized leadership of the African working class. So, everything that we do is we write reports, we keep accountable to our leadership. We stand in solidarity with African self-determination. This is no question, we don't waver on this subject. It's an unconditional solidarity with African self-determination, which means African people are leading their own struggle. We know that African people have to lead the African Revolution. We can't do that as colonizers. And we organize in the white community for reparations to African people, so it is our responsibility and it is in our interest to organize our own people, white people, to this stance of Black power. All right, next slide. I'm also going to do some salutes as well, something that we do in the movement, again, to just, commemorate our leadership, which this is a very historic movement that was founded in 1972 by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And he also created the theory African internationalism, and it's also a developing theory that the party develops and the chairman develops, and we'll be talking a lot about African internationalism today. And this theory is actually being adopted at a very rapid rate. Since the chairman was invited by Oxford University to debate about African Union, we're seeing African people all over the world, wherever they've been forcibly dispersed, saying that the chairman is the leader of the African Revolution, an African inside the borders of the U.S. And that also other colonized communities are like Union del Barrio is indigenous and Mexican people who say that the chairman has inspired them and their theory of how to liberate themselves from parasitic capitalism. So it's really, African internationalism is a call and is a strategic theory to bring about the revolution and to carry out the revolution for real in the real world. And this is not a theory that we as white people could come up with, because but we we are able to unite with it only because of the work of the chairman and African People's Socialist Party, who created our organizations and said, all right, you want to be in solidarity, here's what it means. And so that's why I'm able to talk about this today. So everything that I'm talking about today is because of the work of the chairman, because of the work of the African People's Socialist Party. It is not something I came up with on my own at all. I also, next slide, want to salute Deputy Chair Onizanea Shatella, who carries out the economic work, and you'll be hearing more about the Black Power Blueprint, which she leads, and that is happening a lot of different places, but definitely in St. Louis. The party went there after the Ferguson Rebellion and are still there building self-determination for the Black working class. They're right there in, in the grips of the African working class, living in, food deserts, and their houses are crumbling and they're rebuilding there, and you'll see more of that later on in the presentation. Okay, and then I also want to salute the chairwoman Penny Hess, who she went to the very first meeting of the African People's Socialist Party that called on white solidarity in 1976. So she went to the very first meeting and then devoted her entire life to reparations to African people and has since been under their leadership. So I definitely want to salute Penny Hess, and then my direct leadership, Chair Jesse Neville. And I want to also salute the African People's Socialist Party members in the room today, Israel Finn, and Demetrius was just here, Demetrius Cooper, who is also a member of the African People's Socialist Party. Salute to you, Chair, or to Demetrius. All right. All right. I'll do the next slide, please. So, all white people owe reparations to African people. This is the basis of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. It's what drives our work, that even as LGBTQIA people, or working class people, or people with disabilities, if we are white, we owe reparations to African people. And this is because any of the rights or any of the resources that we have to come at the expense of the African working class. That's how the system works right now. We're on stolen land, so anything that we do, there's no justice on stolen land. And, I know many of you are here today because you're sick of being in the system and you're sick of living in this world, and you want to be on the right side of history, and we are going to be able to talk about what you can do, and one of the things is paying reparations, and this is a reparations event, we are raising reparations, so you'll be able to support the self-determination projects of the African People's Socialist Party, also sign up to volunteer and things like that. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit more about the history of the African People's Socialist Party. So, the African People's Socialist Party has no interest in oppressing anyone but to liberate the world from parasitic capitalism and end colonialism. And, the party is leading this international struggle to liberate Africa and African people from the grips of U.S. imperialism and colonial domination. And African internationalism states that the first commodity of capitalism was African human beings. So this is why we understand capitalism to be parasitic, is because in order for it to function, it has to literally suck the life out of African people, Africa as a continent, and as well as the indigenous people, indigenous land, and other colonized people around the world. That's why we call it parasitic, and you'll hear that again and again, parasitic capitalism. And so in order to overturn capitalism, you have to overturn colonialism. And this is achieved when African people and indigenous people and all colonized people have power over their own lives, they have control over their own land and resources, and control of their own government. And this is the goal of the Black Power movement, is to create this world where no one has to live at the expense of anyone else, because it is the Black working class that has been the basis of life since the assault on Africa. And, that's why we say the African People's Social, that's why they proudly state that they have no interest in oppressing anyone. They are taking all oppressed peoples with them. And if we don't have the African working class as our leadership, as our central focus, then we will be missing the interests of the African working class. And so this includes the oppression of gender and sexuality people, which is why we have a whole campaign called No Pride in Genocide, White LGBTQI Solidarity with Black Power, because we understand that we are struggling, even us as white people, LGBT people, we are struggling under this system, and that, the African People's Socialist Party is saying that this is the movement that if you want to see the celebration of, LGBTQIA people that it is in the Black Power movement. So, I just really salute the party. And this is, we're just calling for the fact that this is a new beginning. Like, we are not going to make the same mistakes that we did in the past of being opportunistic, like Jesse was kind of mentioning, that this is really a historic time, the first time that white people in the Northwest, Portland just had we marched in the Trans March and the Dyke March, and I was like, this is a really historic moment, because never in the Trans March, Dyke March, and Pride has there been white people, under the leadership of the African Revolution, chanting white queers for Black power, white dykes for Black power, and it was very, very, poignant. Ooh. And we had a little bit of callback with our friends that, they hear us say, white dykes for Black power, white dykes for Black power. We say that for a few minutes. And someone else would say, trans power, and genderqueer power, and dyke power. And we'd say, white dykes for Black power, white dykes. And that just represented this shift that is happening because of the work of the African People's Socialist Party saying, they do want us to have power. We do want to have power over our own lives. But it can't happen in this system. The power has to be given to Black and African and Indigenous people and colonized people. And I'm going to go more into all of that as well. So next slide. So this is a little bit of history. So in the 1960s, revolution was the main trend, and that's the chairman. So the chairman, I think he was 21 years old, in the middle there with the sunglasses. He was a part of the 1960s revolution. And this was a time when revolution was the main trend. Black power struggle within the U.S. inspired uprisings all over the world. So you couldn't miss people talking about Black power, and you couldn't, turn on the TV without hearing about Black liberation. And this was inspired, and the African people in the United States were inspiring revolution and uprisings all over the world at this time. And this includes within our sectors, the LGBTQI movement. It inspired us as well. But what had happened is, it became, almost like a mainstream thing, main trend, revolution. Well, the government couldn't have that right, because revolution means that the government that's standing right now has to be destroyed. And so what they did was destroy the Black Power movement. And they did that with COINTELPRO, which is the counterintelligence program that was carried out by the United States government. And its whole purpose was to destroy Black self-determination. And this happened through assassinating the leaders, like 21-year-old Fred Hampton was shot in his bed, sitting next to his wife. They're incarcerated, many leaders, and people involved and people associated with the Black Power movement, and some are still in prison today if they hadn't passed away there already. And they placed drugs in the Black community, crack cocaine. They proved that the CIA put that in the community, and they did that strategically to separate, the African nation from organizing and uprising. And the, police occupation and containment wherever Africans are throughout the world. And we know that this hasn't ended, and that these actions are still being carried out by the U.S. government against Black people, because Black people will not stop organizing for their freedom. And so in the 1960s, revolution was the main trend, popularized by the self-determination of African people. And like I said, this inspired action all over the world. And so, but after COINTELPRO was carried out, just the destruction of these movements, through their ashes came, white people rising up now for, gay liberation and women's liberation. And this had, they left behind the struggle of Black power for their own interests, and because of that, it has to come at the expense of the Black community. Next slide. So really, we as white LGBTQI people, we were inspired by Black people who were not afraid to be themselves. We were seeing, at the time, like, we were okay with being like in underground bars and having sex in the middle of the night in the park, which that's cool if you still do that, but like, we were hiding and we were ashamed of who we were, and we were, might have had the resources to have, the mob, you know, hide us in the basement from the cops and things like that. But when we saw black people marching on the street, not being afraid of who they were, we thought like, hey, that's a great idea. We should do that too. And that is when you see the gay liberation movement starts, is after, you know, during this time. And, you know, instead of uniting with, you know, this anti-colonial perspective, this anti-capitalist perspective, this socialist perspective is what the Black Power movement was in the 1960s. We united with, you know, having equal rights with the oppressor. And one of the things that you can see too, just as an example, is the co-option of the language. So, you know, there was black power, and then you have gay power. There was black liberation, and then there's gay liberation. You know, black is beautiful became gay is good. And then the Black Power fist, which definitely originated in the Black Power movement, you know, was co-opted, still being co-opted. It became the became a white fist, and they put a female symbol around it, and you'll still see that being used in women's and feminist movements today. And you know, at the same time, I want to point out that like there was a sense of liberation, and that's because of the Black liberation movement. That there was something to be liberated from. And even some of the opportunist movements still had, you know, a sense of revolution to them, even though it wasn't under leadership of the African working class. But now you don't hear about liberation, you hear about rights. I want my rights. And that's a rights in the system. So, and in this system, it has to be equal rights with the oppressor, is when we're talking about rights. And, next slide. So we have to fight, when we're fighting for our rights, we're fighting at the expense of the rest of the world. You know, yeah, we've used the momentum of the African liberation movement to fight for our rights to be gay CEOs and gay cops. So that's why you see, you know, this total unity with the rainbow flag and cop cars. And the U.S. imperialist flag is being flown next to the rainbow flag. And people are, you know, think this is something to celebrate. And Pride has become the celebration, and it's the celebration because of its successes. So it's succeeded in lining ourselves, you know, with U.S. imperialism and parasitic capitalism. And this is why most of these prides are sponsored by banks, and they have the cop cars raising the rainbow flag. And, you know, we as white LGBTQI people are supposed to come down and just like feel all of this like good feelings of being accepted, and we can like march half naked down the street, just like so proud of who we are. But black people, African people, no matter who they are, no matter where they are, they cannot walk down the street and feel accepted and safe no matter where they are. So that's just something that's just, you know, the celebration is really just celebrating our successes in, you know, uniting as the oppressor, uniting as oppressing African and indigenous people. You know, this year, prides all over the country are celebrating, like Jesse was saying, the 50th anniversary of Stonewall riots, and we have white gays that are marching down gentrified neighborhoods thanking Marsha P. Johnson for their rights. And, you know, Marsha P. Johnson struggled, and Sylvia Rivera also struggled with houselessness their whole entire